The massive space station called Harmony's Gate floated in the darkness between three stars. It was bigger than most cities on Earth and had taken 5 different alien races working together to build it. The station spun slowly, creating artificial gravity for the thousands of beings who lived and worked inside its metal walls. Today was special because for the first time in human history, Earth had been invited to join the Galactic Council. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the observation deck watching ships arrive from across the galaxy. Some were sleek and silver-like, needles cutting through space. Others were huge and blocky, covered in what looked like living coral. A few seemed to be made of pure energy held together by invisible force fields. Jake had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, ever since humanity had proven they could travel faster than light, and had something useful to offer the galaxy. The human delegation was small compared to the others. Jake commanded the exploration ship called New Horizon, and his diplomatic advisor was Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker. She stood beside him now, reviewing her notes on a tablet computer. Lisa had spent most of her adult life studying alien cultures and languages. She could speak 17 different alien tongues and understand the cultural customs of more than 30 species. If anyone could help humanity make a good first impression, it was her. "Are you nervous?" Jake asked her quietly. Lisa looked up from her tablet and smiled. "Terrified would be more accurate," she said, "but also excited. Do you realize what this means? We're about to sit at the same table as civilizations that are thousands of years older than ours. Some of these species were building starships when humans were still learning to make fire." Jake nodded. He understood the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. Earth's future depended on how well they performed in the next few days. If they impressed the Galactic Council, humanity would gain access to advanced technologies, trade routes, and protection from hostile forces. If they failed, Earth might remain isolated for generations. The station's intercom crackled to life. "All delegation representatives, please report to Assembly Hall 1 for the opening ceremony." The voice spoke in Galactic Standard, a language that Jake and Lisa had been studying intensively. They made their way through the station's corridors, following signs written in dozens of different scripts. The architecture was unlike anything on Earth. The walls curved in impossible angles, and some sections seemed to defy gravity entirely. Other beings walked, floated, or scuttled past them. Jake saw creatures with tentacles where humans had arms, beings made of what looked like living crystal, and entities that seemed to be pure thought given form. Assembly Hall 1 was enormous. The ceiling stretched up so high it disappeared into shadows. Thousands of seats were arranged in concentric circles around a central speaking platform. Each section was designed for different types of beings. Some areas were filled with water for aquatic species. Others had low gravity fields for creatures that couldn't handle normal weight. The human section was modest, with just 12 seats. Near the back, as Jake and Lisa took their places, other delegations were still arriving. The most impressive entrance belonged to the Zephyrian Empire. Their ships had been the largest ones Jake had seen, and now he understood why. The Zephyrians themselves were massive reptilian beings, each one standing nearly 8 feet tall. Their scales shifted color constantly, displaying complex patterns that Jake realized must be part of their communication system. The Zephyrian delegation was led by Ambassador Veltherax, whose scales currently showed deep purples and golds that somehow managed to look both beautiful and threatening. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own superiority. Behind him walked a dozen other Zephyrians, each one wearing elaborate ceremonial armor that seemed to be made from metals Jake didn't recognize. The opening ceremony began with speeches from the 5 founding members of the Galactic Council. Each species had a different way of communicating, and the universal translators built into every seat worked overtime to convert concepts that had no equivalent in human language. The ethereal consciousness spoke through shifts in light and color. The collective of minds shared thoughts directly through psionic broadcasts. The stone singers created complex harmonies that somehow conveyed meaning as clearly as words. When it came time for the newer members to introduce themselves, Jake felt his heart rate increase. He had practiced his speech hundreds of times, but Standing in front of representatives from across the galaxy was different from rehearsing in front of a mirror. Jake stood and walked to the speaking platform. The hall fell quiet as thousands of alien eyes, sensors, and other sensory organs focused on him. He took a deep breath and began to speak. Honored members of the Galactic Council, I am Captain Jake Morrison, representing the planet Earth and the human species. We come here today not as conquerors or as beggars, but as neighbors hoping to learn and contribute to the greater galactic community. He continued his speech, talking about humanity's achievements and what they hope to bring to the galaxy. He mentioned human art, music, and literature. He spoke about their scientific discoveries and their willingness to share knowledge freely. Most importantly, he emphasized humanity's commitment to peaceful cooperation and mutual respect. The speech was going well until Jake began to introduce Lisa. I would like you to meet Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker, our Chief Diplomatic Advisor. Her expertise in xenobiology and interspecies communication has been instrumental in establishing peaceful contact with every alien species humanity has encountered. As Lisa stood to acknowledge the introduction, Ambassador Veltherax rose from his seat. His scales shifted to aggressive reds and blacks as he spoke in a voice that carried easily across the massive hall. Peaceful contact? Veltherax's voice dripped with contempt. This primitive female represents the diplomatic capabilities of your species? How amusing. The Zephyrian Empire has been conducting interstellar diplomacy for 3,000 years. And you send us a mammal who probably learned to speak only decades ago. The hall erupted into shocked murmurs. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Lisa's face had gone pale, but she stood straight and dignified. Despite the public humiliation, Veltherax wasn't finished. Perhaps this backward creature should return to whatever mudball planet spawned her kind and leave serious, diplomatic work to civilized beings who understand the complexities of galactic politics. The insult hung in the air like a physical thing. Jake could feel every being in the hall waiting to see how humanity would respond to such a deliberate provocation. Some species expected humans to grovel for forgiveness. Others probably hoped they would storm out in anger, proving they weren't ready for galactic society. Jake looked at Lisa, seeing the hurt in her eyes despite her professional composure. Then he looked at Veltherax, whose scales now displayed patterns that Jake recognized as smugness and superiority. The Zephyrian ambassador clearly expected his insult to either humiliate humanity into submission or provoke them into an angry outburst that would justify their exclusion from the council. Instead, Jake did something that surprised everyone in the hall, including himself. Jake Morrison took a slow breath and stepped forward. The massive assembly hall remained completely silent as thousands of alien beings waited to see how humanity would respond to the deliberate insult. Some creatures leaned forward in their seats, while others seemed to pull back, as if expecting an explosion of anger or violence, instead of shouting or walking away. Jake moved calmly toward the center of the speaking platform. His footsteps echoed softly in the vast space. When he reached the middle, he turned not toward Ambassador Veltherax, but toward the entire assembly. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear. I want to tell you about Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker, Jake began. 3 years ago, when humanity first detected signals from an alien spacecraft, it was Lisa who developed the mathematical communication protocol that allowed us to make peaceful contact. The ship belonged to the Kepler Mining Consortium, and their vessel was damaged and drifting in our solar system. Jake paused and looked directly at the section where several small, gray-skinned beings sat together. The Kepler miners were suspicious of us at first, which was understandable. They had heard stories about violent species that attacked strangers. But Lisa spent 47 straight hours working to decode their language and customs. She learned that they were herbivores who considered any display of teeth to be a threat. So she taught our entire crew to smile with their lips closed when greeting Kepler visitors. A soft sound came from the Kepler section that Jake recognized as their equivalent of laughter. One of the small beings raised a thin hand in what appeared to be a gesture of acknowledgement. 6 months later, Jake continued, we encountered a draconian scout ship that had been attacked by pirates. Their communication systems were damaged, and they were sending out distress calls that we couldn't understand. Lisa worked for 3 days to modify our translation computers. She discovered that draconian language includes emotional frequencies that human ears can't normally detect. She developed a way to convert those frequencies into colors that we could see on our displays. Jake turned slightly toward a section filled with tall, elegant beings whose skins seemed to shimmer with internal light. The Draconian crew later told us that Lisa's translation system was more accurate than some systems used by species they had known for centuries. They said her understanding of their emotional context was better than most Draconian children achieve. Several of the Draconian delegates touched their throats in what Jake knew was a gesture of respect. Their leader, Ambassador Kiran, stood briefly and nodded toward Lisa before sitting back down. 2 years ago, Jake went on, we received a distress signal from the Crystal Gardens, a space station in the Vega system. A plague had broken out among several different species who were visiting there. The station's medical computers couldn't identify the disease because it affected each species differently. The situation was desperate. Jake's voice grew warmer as he continued. Lisa volunteered to go there, even though it meant risking her own life. She spent 6 weeks in quarantine, working alongside doctors from 12 different species. She was the one who realized that the plague wasn't actually a single disease, but a complex interaction between different bacterial strains that each species had brought with them. Her insight led to a cure that saved more than 3,000 lives. The assembly hall was so quiet that Jake could hear the soft humming of the station's air recycling systems. He turned slowly, making eye contact with delegates from different sections. Lisa Parker has 3 advanced degrees in xenobiology from Earth's finest universities. She speaks 17 alien languages fluently and can understand basic communication in 43 more. She has published research papers on interspecies psychology that are now used in diplomatic training programs across 3 different star systems. She has never started a fight, never broken a treaty, and never failed to find common ground with a species that wanted to communicate. Jake paused and looked directly at Ambassador Veltharax for the first time since beginning his speech. The Zephyrian scales had shifted to darker colors that Jake couldn't interpret. But more important than any of that, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast hall, Lisa Parker is my friend. She is someone who gets excited when she learns about a new culture. She stays up late reading about alien philosophy and art. She has spent her entire adult life trying to build bridges between different ways of thinking and living. She believes that every species has something valuable to contribute to the galaxy, and she has dedicated her career to proving that belief true. Jake turned back to address the full assembly. Ambassador Veltharax called her a primitive mammal who learned to speak only decades ago. He suggested that she should return to what he called a mudball planet and leave serious work to civilized beings. I want you to know that I disagree with that assessment. The human captain's voice grew stronger. I believe that civilization isn't measured by how long your species has been traveling between stars. I don't think it's determined by the size of your ships or the power of your weapons. True civilization is measured by how you treat others, especially those who are different from you. It's shown by your willingness to listen to new ideas and learn from unfamiliar perspectives. Jake looked around the hall again, taking in the incredible diversity of life forms gathered there. Every being in this hall has evolved on a different world under different conditions. We have different ways of thinking, different values, different strengths and weaknesses. That diversity isn't a problem to be solved. It's a treasure to be celebrated. He paused and took a breath before continuing. When Ambassador Veltharax insults Lieutenant Commander Parker, he isn't just attacking one human being. He's attacking the principle that every species has value and dignity regardless of how recently they joined the galactic community. He's suggesting that might makes right and that older civilizations have the right to humiliate newer ones. Jake's voice remained calm and measured, but there was steel underneath it now. I reject that philosophy completely. I believe that true strength comes not from the ability to insult others, but from the wisdom to recognize worth in those who are different from ourselves. The strongest civilizations are those that lift others up rather than tearing them down. The hall remained completely silent. Jake could see representatives from dozens of species leaning forward, hanging on every word. Even some of the Zephyrian delegates seemed uncomfortable with their ambassador's behavior. "So I want to make something clear," Jake said, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembly. "Humanity does not demand an apology from Ambassador Valtharax. We don't need his approval to know our own worth. Instead, I want to extend an invitation." Jake turned toward the Zephyrian section. "Ambassador, I invite you to spend time with Lieutenant Commander Parker. Learn about her work and her achievements. See for yourself what she has contributed to interspecies understanding. I think you might be surprised by what you discover." Jake stepped back from the center of the platform. "Thank you for your time and attention. Humanity looks forward to working with all of you to build a better galaxy for every species." As Jake returned to his seat, the hall erupted into sound. Different species expressed approval in their own ways, creating a cacophony of chirps, whistles, harmonic vibrations, and light displays. Lisa looked at Jake with tears in her eyes. Though she was smiling, Ambassador Valtharax sat motionless, his scales now a confused mixture of colors that seemed to shift randomly. For the first time in his long diplomatic career, he found himself completely unsure how to respond. Within hours of Jake Morrison's speech, something unexpected began happening across the galaxy. The opening ceremony at Harmony's Gate had been broadcast live to billions of beings on thousands of worlds, as was traditional for major Galactic Council events. But this time, instead of the usual brief mentions in news reports, the human captain's response to Ambassador Valtharax became the most discussed topic on the galactic communication networks, on the water world of Aquatica Prime, the dolphin-like. Cetaceans gathered in their floating cities to debate what they called the dignity response. Their philosophers had long taught that true wisdom came from understanding rather than dominance, but they had never seen the principle applied so effectively in galactic politics. Elder Resonance, the most respected teacher on their world, declared that humanity had demonstrated a form of strength that even the ancient cetaceans were still learning to master. The news reached the crystal forests of Mineralia, where the Silicon Collective processed information through living rock formations that grew like trees but thought like computers. The collective had always struggled to understand biological emotions, but something about Jake's speech resonated through their crystalline networks. They began incorporating concepts of measured dignity and respectful strength into their decision-making processes, finding that these ideas improved their interactions with organic species significantly, far in the Outer Rim territories. The warrior clans of Draxos received the broadcast during their evening combat training sessions. The Draxans were a proud people who had built their entire culture around concepts of honor and strength in battle. When the clan leaders watched Jake's response, they fell into heated debates that lasted for days. Some argued that the human had shown weakness by not challenging Valtharax to combat. Others insisted that Jake had demonstrated a form of courage they had never considered before: war. Chief Brutus of the Ironfang clan was the first to change his mind completely. He had spent 30 years proving his strength through victory in battle, but watching Jake stand calmly in front of the entire galaxy and defend his companion without raising his voice or making threats gave Brutus a new perspective on what strength really meant. He began teaching his warriors that the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from turning enemies into allies through demonstration of character. The impact was even more dramatic among the younger generations of established species. On the Zephyrian homeworld of Serpentis, university students organized peaceful demonstrations calling for their government to apologize to the human delegation. They carried signs written in both Zephyrian script and human languages, with messages like "Dignity has no species" and "Respect all minds." The student protests spread to other Zephyrian worlds within days. Young Zephyrians who had grown up hearing about their empire's superiority began questioning whether insulting other species really made them stronger. They pointed out that humanity had achieved faster than light travel in less than a century, while it had taken the Zephyrians over 1,000 years to develop the same technology. Perhaps, the students argued, there was something to be learned from these newcomers rather than something to be feared. The Altarian collective found the concept of individual dignity particularly fascinating. As a hive mind species, they had always thought in terms of collective good and shared consciousness. The idea that a single being could represent the values of an entire species through personal choice and character was revolutionary to them. They began experimenting with allowing individual Altarians to make independent decisions about how to treat members of other species. Rather than relying solely on collective protocols, the results were remarkable. Altarian trade negotiations became more flexible and creative. Their scientific collaborations with other species improved dramatically because individual researchers could adapt their approach based on their partner's needs rather than following rigid hive directives. Within weeks, the Altarian collective announced that they were restructuring their entire diplomatic corps based on what they called the Morrison Protocol. Back on Harmony's Gate, Ambassador Valtherix watched the galactic response to Jake's speech with growing frustration and confusion. He had expected the human to either grovel for forgiveness or storm out in anger. Either response would have proven Zephyrian superiority and justified excluding humanity from serious galactic affairs. Instead, his deliberate insult had somehow elevated the human status across the galaxy. Valtherix received increasingly uncomfortable reports from his staff about the situation back home. The student protests were growing larger every day. Several younger members of the Zephyrian diplomatic corps had submitted requests to transfer to departments that worked with newer species rather than maintaining traditional empire policies. Most disturbing of all, 3 different Zephyrian colonies had sent messages expressing interest in establishing direct trade. Relationships with Earth. The ambassador's own scales had been fluctuating between confused patterns for days. He had been trained in traditional Zephyrian diplomacy, which relied on establishing dominance through displays of superior knowledge, technology, and cultural sophistication. But Jake Morrison had somehow turned the tables without using any of those tools. Instead of competing on Zephyrian terms, the human had changed the entire framework of the conversation. Meanwhile, Lisa Parker found herself busier than she had ever been in her life. Representatives from dozens of species requested private meetings to discuss her work in xenobiology and interspecies communication. The Kepler Mining Consortium offered her a permanent position as their chief diplomatic advisor. The Draconian Academy of Sciences invited her to deliver a series of lectures on emotional translation techniques. Even some Zephyrian researchers, working quietly through unofficial channels, expressed interest in learning about her methods. Jake noticed that other species were beginning to change how they interacted with each other as well. During the formal negotiation sessions that followed the opening ceremony, he observed more patience, more careful listening, and more attempts to find common ground rather than simply asserting positions. The ethereal consciousness began including emotional context in their light-based communications after learning about Lisa's work with the Draconians. The Stone Singers modified their harmonic patterns to be more accessible to species with different hearing ranges. The most significant change came from an unexpected source. The Void Dwellers, a mysterious species that rarely participated in galactic affairs, sent a message requesting a private meeting with the human delegation. No one could. Remember the last time the Void Dwellers had shown interest in newcomer species? They were among the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, predating even the Zephyrian Empire by thousands of years. When Jake and Lisa met with the Void Dweller representative, a being of shifting shadows and starlight called Echo of Distant Worlds, they learned something that surprised them. The Void Dwellers had been watching galactic politics for millennia, waiting for a species that could demonstrate what they called evolutionary wisdom. They explained that most species went through predictable phases of development, first survival, then expansion, then dominance, and finally either destruction or transcendence. Your species has shown transcendence qualities before achieving dominance, Echo told them through patterns of light and darkness. This is unprecedented in our observations. We believe humanity may represent a new path forward for galactic civilization. The Void Dwellers offered humanity access to technologies and knowledge that could advance their development by thousands of years. But they also warned that such rapid progress would bring new challenges and responsibilities. As Jake considered the offer, he realized that his simple decision to respond with dignity rather than anger had set in motion changes that none of them could have predicted. The question now was whether humanity was ready for the consequences of their choice. Ambassador Veltherix stood in his private quarters aboard Harmony's Gate, watching the protests on his homeworld through a secure communication link. Thousands of young Zephyrians filled the Capitol Plaza, their scales displaying patterns of unity and defiance that he had never seen before. Their chants echoed through the transmission speakers, calling for a new approach to galactic diplomacy based on what they termed human principles. The ambassador's own scales shifted to angry reds and blacks as he cut the transmission. In his 60 years of diplomatic service, he had never faced such a humiliating situation. His carefully planned insult of the human female should have demonstrated Zephyrian superiority and put the newcomers in their proper place. Instead, it had somehow made him look like a fool while elevating humanity's status across the galaxy. Veltherix had spent the past week trying to understand how Captain Morrison had turned the situation around so completely. The humans' response had been neither aggressive nor submissive, two reactions that Zephyrian diplomatic training had prepared him to handle. Instead, Morrison had done something that Veltherix's extensive education had never covered. He had responded with grace and wisdom that made the original insult seem petty and cruel, but Veltherix was not prepared to admit defeat. He had risen to his current position through decades of successful manipulation and political maneuvering. If peaceful methods had failed to put humanity in their place, perhaps it was time to try a different approach. The ambassador activated his personal communication system and sent an encrypted message to Fleet Commander Serpentis, his cousin who controlled military operations in the border regions near human space. The message was brief but clear: create a situation that would force the humans to abandon their peaceful philosophy and show their true nature. 3 days later, the crisis began. A group of Zephyrian ships approached the contested region near the human colony world of New Denver. The area had been under dispute for months, with both species claiming territorial rights based on different interpretations of ancient exploration treaties. Until now, both sides had agreed to keep the disagreement peaceful while diplomats worked toward a solution. The Zephyrian ships began stopping and searching human cargo vessels, claiming they were looking for illegal weapons shipments. When human crews protested, the Zephyrians became increasingly aggressive, seizing cargo and detaining crew members for extended interrogations. The harassment escalated quickly, with Zephyrian commanders inventing new violations and imposing arbitrary fines. Back on Harmony's Gate, Jake Morrison received urgent reports from the New Denver colonial government. Governor Pete Williams, a former military officer who had helped establish the colony, demanded immediate action. "Captain, they're deliberately provoking us," Williams said through the long-range communication link. "My people are getting angry, and I can't blame them. We need to show these lizards that we won't be pushed around." Jake felt the pressure mounting from multiple directions. His own crew, led by Commander Ryan Torres, argued that humanity's peaceful response had been effective in the diplomatic arena but wouldn't work against deliberate military aggression. "Sir, with respect, these aren't reasonable beings looking for dialogue," Torres said during a private meeting. "They're testing us to see if we'll fight back. If we don't show strength, now they'll just keep pushing until they force us into a corner." Even Lisa Parker, who had been humanity's strongest advocate for peaceful solutions, began expressing doubts about their approach. "Jake, I've been studying Zephyrian psychology for weeks now," she said. "Their culture respects strength above everything else. They might interpret our continued peaceful responses as weakness rather than wisdom." The situation grew worse when Zephyrian forces seized a human medical ship called the Mercy's Hand that was carrying emergency supplies to refugee camps on the border worlds. The ship's crew of 12 included 3 doctors and 2 nurses who had been working in the disputed region for months, providing medical care to anyone who needed it regardless of species. The Zephyrian commander claimed the medical supplies could be converted into weapons, and announced that the crew would face trial for smuggling. The news of the seizure spread quickly through human space. Colonists who had been impressed by Jake's diplomatic approach at Harmony's Gate now demanded military action. Protests erupted on Earth and several colony worlds, with angry crowds calling for immediate retaliation against the Zephyrian Empire. Military leaders who had been quietly skeptical of the peaceful approach now spoke openly about the need for a strong response. Admiral Mancy Foster, the highest-ranking military officer in human space, sent Jake a direct message that was barely disguised as a suggestion. Captain Morrison, the Zephyrians have crossed a line by seizing a medical vessel. International law recognizes attacks on medical personnel as war crimes. If we don't respond with force, we'll be seen as weak by every species in the galaxy. Jake found himself facing the most difficult decision of his career. Everything he believed about the power of dignity and peaceful response was being tested by a situation that seemed designed to force him into abandoning those principles. The Zephyrians appeared to be betting that humanity would eventually revert to violence when pushed far enough, proving that their peaceful philosophy was just a facade. The pressure increased when intelligence reports revealed that the seizure of the medical ship was not an isolated incident. Zephyrian forces were systematically harassing human vessels throughout the disputed region, with each provocation designed to escalate tensions. It was clear that someone in the Zephyrian hierarchy was deliberately trying to start a conflict. During a heated meeting with his senior staff, Jake listened to increasingly urgent arguments for military action. "Sir, they have 12 of our people," Commander Torres said. "The Mercy's Hand crew includes Dr. Carol Jensen, who developed the new treatment for radiation poisoning that saved hundreds of lives. We can't just leave them in Zephyrian custody." Lisa added her own concerns. "Jake, I've been monitoring Zephyrian communications. They're planning to put the medical crew on trial for terrorism charges. The penalties could include execution. We're running out of time for diplomatic solutions." Jake stood at the observation window in his quarters, looking out at the stars and trying to find clarity in the overwhelming situation. Every instinct told him that responding to violence with greater violence would only prove the Zephyrians right about humanity's nature. But he also couldn't ignore his responsibility to protect innocent people who were counting on him. The decision became even more difficult when he received a message from Dr. Jensen herself, transmitted secretly from her Zephyrian prison. "Captain Morrison, please don't let them use us as an excuse for war," she said. "We knew the risks when we chose to work in disputed territory. The principles you demonstrated at the Council are more important than our individual lives." As Jake wrestled with the impossible choice between his principles and his people, he realized that this moment would define not just his own character, but humanity's entire future in galactic society. Ambassador Veltherix had succeeded in creating a test that seemed to have no good answers. The question was whether Jake could find a third option that no one else had considered. Jake Morrison sat in his quarters for 3 hours, staring at the tactical reports and diplomatic messages that covered his desk. Every piece of information pointed toward the same conclusion. Ambassador Veltherix had created a perfect trap. If humanity responded with military force, they would prove that their peaceful philosophy was just pretense. If they did nothing, 12 innocent people would likely die, and humanity would appear weak to the entire galaxy. But as Jake read Dr. Carol Jensen's message for the 5th time, something clicked in his mind. She had said that the principles he demonstrated at the Council were more important than individual lives. What if there was a way to demonstrate those principles even more powerfully than before? Jake activated his communication system and sent a message to every major news network in human space, as well as the galactic broadcasting stations that had covered the original Council meeting. Within an hour, he was addressing not just humanity, but billions of beings across the galaxy. "My fellow humans and friends throughout the galaxy," Jake began, standing in the main communication center of Harmony's Gate. 3 days ago, Zephyrian forces seized a human medical ship and imprisoned its crew. Many people are calling for military retaliation, and I understand that anger. When innocent people are threatened, our first instinct is to respond with force. Jake paused and looked directly into the camera. But I want to propose something different. Something that I believe will demonstrate the true strength of the principles we discussed at the Galactic Council. I am announcing that humanity will send medical aid to every being in the disputed border region, regardless of species or political affiliation. This includes Zephyrian civilians who may be suffering in the conflict zones. The response was immediate and explosive. Commander Torres burst into the communication center, his face red with anger. "Sir, you can't be serious. They've taken our people prisoner, and you want to send them medical supplies?" Jake held up a hand for silence and continued his broadcast. "Furthermore, I will personally pilot the lead medical ship into the disputed region. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker has volunteered to join me, along with several dozen other human medical personnel. We will carry supplies for treating radiation poisoning, viral infections, and combat injuries. Our ships will be clearly marked as medical vessels, and they will be completely unarmed." The camera operator's hands were shaking as Jake's words sank in. This wasn't just a diplomatic gesture. It was putting his own life at risk to prove a point. "We do this not because we are weak," Jake continued, "but because we believe that protecting life is more important than protecting pride. We do this because we believe that even our enemies deserve medical care when they are suffering. We do this because someone must choose to break the cycle of violence and retaliation that has plagued this galaxy for too long." Jake's voice grew stronger as he reached the conclusion of his statement. "To Ambassador Valferix and the Zephyrian Empire, I say this. We are coming to help your people, just as we would help anyone else in need. If you choose to attack medical vessels and medical personnel, the entire galaxy will see what your empire truly values. If you choose to allow us to provide aid, perhaps we can find a path toward real peace." The broadcast ended, and Jake immediately began preparing for what many considered a suicide mission. Within 12 hours, 5 human medical ships were loaded with supplies and staffed with volunteers. Every person who joined the mission knew they might not return, but the response was overwhelming. Dr. Michael Roberts, the chief medical officer from New Denver, insisted on joining despite his wife's protests. Nurse Patricia Williams volunteered even though she had 3 young children at home. Engineer David Clark modified the ship's communication systems to broadcast medical assistance offers in 17 different languages. The departure of the medical convoy became a galactic media event. News crews from dozens of species covered the launch, with many commentators expressing amazement at humanity's response to aggression. The Altarian Collective issued a statement calling the mission the most profound demonstration of evolutionary wisdom in recorded galactic history. The Draconian Empire announced that they would provide escort ships to protect the medical convoy, not to help them fight, but to witness their courage. As Jake's ship, the Hope Rising, approached the contested border region, the entire galaxy watched through live broadcasts. Zephyrian military commanders found themselves in an impossible position. They had been prepared to fight human warships, but attacking clearly marked medical vessels carrying aid for Zephyrian civilians would be seen as barbaric by every civilized species. The first test came when a squadron of Zephyrian fighters intercepted the medical convoy. Squadron leader Vexandra, a young officer who had grown up hearing about the glorious conquests of the Empire, found herself staring at ships that carried no weapons and broadcast nothing but offers of medical assistance. Her orders were to turn the humans away by any means necessary, but she could not bring herself to fire on medical personnel. Instead, Vexandra did something that shocked everyone, including herself. She opened the communication channel to Jake's ship and said, "Human vessels, this is Squadron Leader Vexandra of the Imperial Fleet. I I have wounded personnel on 3 of my ships from a recent pirate attack. Can you provide medical assistance? Jake's response was immediate. Squadron leader, we would be honored to help. Please transmit the medical data for your wounded, and our doctors will prepare treatment options. The moment was broadcast live across the galaxy. A Zephyrian military officer, whose species had just imprisoned human medical personnel, was asking those same humans for help with her own wounded. And the humans, who had every reason to refuse, responded with immediate offers of aid. The effect rippled outward like waves in a pond. Other Zephyrian ships began requesting medical assistance. Civilian colonies that had been caught in the crossfire of the territorial dispute sent desperate pleas for help with refugee crises and medical emergencies. Within days, human medical teams were working alongside Zephyrian doctors in field. Hospitals throughout the disputed region. The images broadcast across the galaxy were powerful beyond any political speech. Human medics treating Zephyrian children injured in pirate attacks. Zephyrian engineers helping human doctors repair medical equipment. Species that had been on the brink of war instead working together to save lives. Ambassador Valtherix watched the reports from his quarters with growing horror. His carefully planned provocation had backfired completely. Instead of proving human weakness, Jake Morrison's response had made the Zephyrian Empire look cruel and petty by comparison. Protests on Zephyrian worlds were growing larger every day, with citizens demanding the release of the imprisoned medical crew and an end to the territorial harassment. The final blow came when Valtherix received a message from the Zephyrian High Council. The Empire's ruling body, faced with overwhelming public pressure and the obvious moral superiority of the human response, ordered the immediate release of the Mercy's hand crew and the establishment of formal negotiations to resolve the territorial dispute, but the consequences went far beyond the immediate crisis. The Galactic Council, inspired by humanity's demonstration of principle under pressure, began drafting new diplomatic protocols based on what they called the human doctrine. The core principle was simple. True strength was measured not by the ability to dominate others, but by the courage to help others even when they had done you harm. Species across the galaxy began adopting similar approaches to conflict resolution. The warrior clans of Draxos established medical corps dedicated to treating enemies as well as allies. The Altarian Collective restructured their decision-making processes to prioritize compassion alongside logic. Even the ancient Void Dwellers emerged from their isolation to offer advanced medical technologies to any species that embraced the principles humanity had demonstrated. Jake Morrison returned to Harmony's Gate as a hero not just to humanity, but to countless beings across the galaxy who had been inspired by his example. But when reporters asked him about his historic achievement, he deflected the praise to others. "I didn't change anything," Jake said. "I just remembered what Dr. Jensen told me. Some principles are more important than individual lives." The real heroes are the medical personnel who risk their lives every day to help others, regardless of politics or species. They're the ones who are building the future we all want to live in. Ambassador Valtherix, meanwhile, found his political career in ruins. But as he prepared to return to his homeworld in disgrace, he realized something unexpected. For the first time in his life, he was proud of the galaxy he lived in. Jake Morrison had taught him that true victory came not from defeating enemies, but from turning them into friends through the power of unshakable principles. The age of dignity had begun,